Have you ever wondered whether the problems in the world today would exist if we had deeper connection to ourselves, others, and the environment, and acted from that place?
Welcome to the Conscious Action Podcast with your hosts Brian Berneman and Kayla Greenville, who believe that connection is the key to taking conscious action as individuals and creating a better world.
We are here to raise awareness and inspire meaningful action by sharing stories, knowledge, and conversations with thought leaders and change makers.
From sustainability to well-being and everything related to conscious living, our mission is to empower you to be the change that you want to see in the world. Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Action Podcast. I am Brian Berneman, your host, and I have the pleasure to be joined all the way from Thames here in New Zealand as well by Kara-Leah. Thank you, Kara-Leah, so much for taking the time to be here. And for what I know, it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So thank you for being here. And for everyone that is listening, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So my name is Kara-Leah, and I've recently realized that I really just need to own the fact that what I do is I'm a spiritual teacher. Didn't want to call myself that for a long time. I kind of edged around it in terms of like, I teach this, I teach that. I'm like, fuck it, I'm a spiritual teacher. And what that means is that I support people to meet reality as it is. And I help them shift from identification with the I self, right? The story of me, their thoughts, their feelings, etc., to identification with awareness or consciousness and knowing themselves as that. So that's my professional working life. I'm also a writer, journalist by trade. I have a son who's 12 and I love to dance. So I go to all the festivals, and Brian and I have been known to hit the dance floor a few times. I always love it when I see Brian on the dance floor. Yeah. So that's a little bit about me.
Beautiful. It's so interesting, a lot of times when just as we are all the time evolving and changing and rediscovering, in a sense, different parts of ourselves, it's that, like, what do we call ourselves? Like, I had someone the other day asking me for an interview, what do I call you? And I'm like, okay, let me check in and see what do you call me at this point, instead of what I've been calling myself or people have been calling me. Before we get a little bit more in depth with that and a few things that you said that I think that it's wonderful, can you share a little bit about your own path and what led you to actually be doing this at this point?
I was always a curious seeker, always asking questions about the nature of reality. Like I grew up in the Presbyterian church, and was really involved in youth group as a teenager, but started to argue with my leaders around, but if Jesus says love everyone, shouldn't we be loving gay people? I think that was the last time I went to youth group, was when I was asking that question. And then in my 20s, I ended up going overseas and partying, traveling, being a backpacker, and seeking, reading all the books. Like I read Celestine Prophecy when it first came out. It was like 1994 when I read it. I just left high school at that time. So next important sort of landmarks, I got into yoga because I had back issues, major back issues. I'd had a spinal fusion when I was 15. And then when I was in my 20s, I started to get sciatic pain again. And the doctors are like, you're going to need another operation. And I'm just like, yeah, nah, I'm going to sort this out myself. You guys didn't sort it the first time. Why would I believe you'd sort it the second time? So I got into yoga, and yoga, meditation, consciousness expanding drugs. Like I was living in Canada, so I was doing quite a lot of mushrooms. And all of that curiosity and that seeking, etc., basically led to kundalini awakening / psychosis, as my patterns of the psyche and avoidance kind of collided with the expansion. So I ended up in 2004 in the psych ward twice. There was like a month apart, and my whole life imploded. I was 29, I was engaged, I got dumped. I was trying to make it as a writer. I'd written a screenplay that had won a national award in Canada. So, like it was going somewhere. But then ending up in the psych ward was just like, oh my God, I got to go back to New Zealand and sort my shit out. So that's what I did. I came home and just really dove into home practice because I couldn't find any yoga teachers that I really wanted to go to. I was living in a town that had no yoga, basically. That led me to teaching yoga in 2006. And things started to, like, once I began teaching, I was like, whoa, I got to commit to my students. So I started practicing every day. I ended up doing my training in 2010 with Shiva Ray, who's amazing. She's so embodied. You know, she is like an embodiment of the goddess. She was amazing. And that's when I got introduced to classical tantra and a specific tantric practice that I just took to like a duck to water. Tantra spoke to me. Probably the next major milestone was 2015 when I decided I was going to do 1,000 days in a row of that tantric practice. And it took me 6 or 7 years to complete that because I dropped the ball twice, but I did it. I did 1,000 days in a row, and that was next level. That really like pierced something in my experience of reality. And as a result of doing that, I discovered the teachings of Christopher Wallace in about 2018. I released my memoir, my third book, in 2018, which was freaking terrifying, I have to say. I was terrified. It's like, oh my God. Yeah. And so along the way, I just kept teaching people and working with people and refining how I was working with people. So initially it was just physical, you know, like we were doing yoga, but it was always from the perspective of self-realization. So I always taught from that, where the yogic practices are a tool to self-realize. They're not the end in themselves. But then as I went on, I started to refine and started to work with people more on the mental, emotional, and energetic level. So I've worked with thousands of people now over the years and run Direct Realization Tantra immersions, which are, I got to say, the next level. Like for people who really just want to wake the fuck up. Yeah, I'm watching people come on them and their whole experience of reality changes. It's such a delight. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean, such an amazing journey.
It's freaking hilarious.
First of all, like I already knew about your journey, and I think that, you know, I think that one of the key things for me that I take away anytime that I see you is I have this thing a lot of times because of my own path that I didn't seek to be teaching. I just went to do my own practice, and just by doing that, now I'm leading and facilitating and doing all of these things. And I notice so much when people, like, when there's bullshit and when there's actual, you know, like, understanding, when there's embodied truth. And it doesn't mean that we have it all figured out. In certain things, I think that's there, and that's one of the things that anytime that I see you and anytime that I hear you speak, I get that sense that you're speaking from that place of truth, and from a place of, you know, like, you've gone through this journey, you had that awakening process, you've actually delved into the practice, you did those, you know, like 1,000 days in a row. Like, even if you stopped at some point, you recommitted. It's like that discipline, and to be able to do that, I think that it's really interesting for a lot of people to hear, because I think that a lot of times, you know, people see us where we are now, and they don't see the entire journey. And I think that a lot of times it's important to see that.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I was a mess. Like after 2004, I was a complete mess. I felt so freaking bad for so long. But you know, the curious thing about my journey is I got on the internet in 2006. Was it 2000? Yeah, and started blogging. I started blogging. I had a blog called Be Conscious Now. It's gone now. I mean, you can probably find it on the way back then, you know, time machine on the internet. So what that does mean though, then I started the Yoga Lunchbox in 2008, and I can't remember when I started my YouTube channel, but there's actually things I wrote 14 years ago, and there's videos of me like 10 years ago. And so from that perspective, people can go back and they can see what I was like 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And the shift is palpable in terms of the level of integration or embodiment or ease or joy. It's just like, oh, wow, I'm not the same person that I was. It's just clear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things for me, embodiment has been a huge part of my practice, and what I believe it's part of this path of realization. And one of the things that I would love to get your viewpoint on is how a lot of times a lot of people that are doing yoga classes have no idea about that side of things. They are just going and doing, and this is just my point of view, they are just going and doing a movement or fitness exercise with yoga asana or yoga poses, yet there's no understanding. So my question is, A, do you see this? And also, how, when you're working with people, do you introduce this light of this other understanding alongside the actual movements or the asanas?
Mm-hmm. I do see that big time. And what I've realized is because of what happened for me in 2004, where there was awakening unfolded, there was a paradigm shift in perspective of reality as such. So it meant that when I taught, I was teaching people from the perspective of orientation to awareness. So I would be instructing, be aware of da 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 da. So it wasn't like put your foot here, be aware of what happens when you put your foot there. And that shift into inviting people into awareness, inviting people into noticing is the difference, right? Because then it's bringing people into self-awareness, which leads into self-reflection, which ultimately leads into self-realization, knowing oneself as awareness. Now, if there's a yoga teacher teaching who has no embodied direct experience of what it means to be realized, they can't really teach it because they don't know it yet. And I mean, if they've been taught by someone who's self-realized, they might cue in a way that leads to it, right? But you can't, this is an embodied practice that a teacher can only take a student kind of as far as they've gone. They can kind of point further, So when I teach, I don't actually teach a lot of physical embodiment anymore at all. I'm just, from my perspective, I'm like, there's a shit ton of epic yoga teachers out there. I don't have to do that anymore. I just don't want to tell people what to do with their bodies. That said, I really love, so when I lead immersions, I wasn't teaching any physical stuff on there, but I noticed that people actually did need to move their body. So I started to teach on the immersions in a different kind of way, where I put the music on, we'd all be in a circle together, and I would give, I'd kind of set the container and give a little bit of instruction and really invite people to move from awareness, to let the breath lead, and to explore and be curious about their body. And so I discovered that there's a way to teach where I'm not telling people what to do, but rather I'm giving them permission to be with and to play with their own body, and to recognize that when there is, when we surrender to the breath will actually lead us into practice, you see. So that's how I work now. And so I am looking at starting to do some embodiment teaching down here in Thames, where I'm not going to tell people what to do. I'm going to set the container, I'm going to put on the music, and I'm going to invite people to just move freely whilst holding the space. Yeah.
Yes, that's beautiful. I think that, it's so important, and in my own experience, it's been an interesting journey of understanding my role as well as a space holder or as a facilitator, creating, as you're saying, that container, creating that space that allows people and gives them permission to do what feels right at that moment, or however they want to move, however they want to explore things, instead of being like, okay, now let's do that. Even though I know a lot of times there's certain movements, there's certain postures that unlock certain energy patterns. So I'm like, okay, like there's an invitation for that as well sometimes. And a lot of times it's like, okay, let's just feel. And I think that in my own experience, and I wanted to get your take on this, is that as a facilitator, I actually use a lot of times the word facilitator and the word guide or space holder more than teacher, partly because I know what teacher represents for me and what teacher represents for a lot of people in terms of power dynamics. So I wanted to bring this topic as well, because I know that as we're recording this, we are in August, and like in a few weeks before, or perhaps a month before, here in New Zealand, there's been a few things talked about in terms of this like teacher or facilitator role and what has transpired. So first, before we get into that, what do you see the role of the teacher, or that condition of the power dynamic?
Okay, that's a huge question, and I'm excited to dive into it. I'm just going to put my cat outside the room and shut the door so she can't come in because she gets distracting. Okay, I know you guys can still hear me.
Yes.
So I use the words interchangeably a bit. I do often prefer facilitator, and at the same time, I'm definitely in the role of teacher. So particularly when I'm leading the Direct Realization Tantra immersions, I'm teaching the practices and the view teachings and the frameworks of Classical Tantra as I'm facilitating what's unfolding. And what I would say is that there's always going to be inherent power in whether it's facilitator or teacher or instructor or whatever it is. There is always inherent power in that position that's usually projected into it by the participants, right? Because you're the person that apparently knows more, right? So people are going to project that power in. And to a degree, there is more power because you do know more. That's just the fact of it. Like when I first started teaching yoga, and I hadn't been trained at all. I had no training. I was just, and I was freaking out about it. And one of my friends said to me, he's like, well, if you know more yoga than the other people in the room, then it totally makes sense that you're the one teaching them because you just know more than they do. I was like, oh yeah, it does kind of make sense. It's not that you have to know all the things, just know a little bit more, right? What I think is really, really important though, is that the teacher or the facilitator understands the inherent nature of power dynamics and how that will elicit certain reactions or responses from students, because humans are wired for status. Right? You put humans in a room, and what humans are doing unconsciously is determining where they are in the hierarchy, where they are in the status, and how they can improve their status by acting in a particular way or by allying with a certain person, et cetera, et cetera. So humans are always doing this thing around status. So it's my job as the facilitator, as the teacher, to be aware of that, to see when it's happening, and to not buy into it, right? Because the moment, if I, as a teacher or facilitator, am using that role to boost my own sense of power, if I'm getting off on it, then I'm going to encourage that shit, because then I get to get off on being the one with the power, right? And I see that happen. Like I watched the Tony Robbins documentary 3 or 4 times, and I actually made it required viewing on one of my immersions because we were looking at power dynamics between facilitators and audience members. And it was extraordinary because he was completely imposing upon the people his perspective of reality. It was just a power over and a dominating and an authoritarian approach. And that's the way a lot of shit's been done in Western society for so long. So people expect that that's what happens with teachers, facilitators, participants. But it doesn't have to be that way. So what I tend to do is sit in a circle for a start, and that immediately shifts the hierarchical power. Like if I've got 12 people in little rows before me on a seat, then everyone's attention is on me, and it looks like I'm the one who knows. If we are all sitting in a circle, then everyone can see everyone equally, and the center point, I usually work with an altar, is the altar. And so that is the center of it. So there's a shift that happens just in rearranging the room, literally. And I learned that from Shiva. Like she always taught in a circle. She'll have 80 people doing yoga, and it's in a circle, as much as possible. And then something else I do is that I reference the fact that there is wisdom in the room, and I listen deeply, and I don't presume to know all the things. And I really cultivate curiosity as much as possible. just feeling into, and I notice, I notice the dynamics that can play out in terms of how people might be playing out their, seeking approval, for example, or people pleasing, for example. And I can see very clearly how easy it would be for a teacher, facilitator, etc., to take advantage of those behavior patterns for their own purposes. And I choose not to. And I actually, because I don't want to do that shit. At the moment I start doing that, I'm actually undermining, on the very deepest level, the work I'm offering into the world.
Yes, yes. There's for me, and I know, as I said before, that sometimes it's the word, but it's that place of that dynamic, and it's as you're saying, it's ingrained in us to have that happen. And I also, as much as possible, always in circles, always, like sitting on the same level as everyone else, and as well to be able to recognize for myself and taking responsibility of my role. I feel a lot of times, that responsibility, if I'm in front, or if I am the one facilitating, or if I'm the ones holding the space, or I'm the teacher, regardless of how I call myself, if I am the one, as you're saying, with more knowledge on that specific like topic, and I'm presenting, it's my responsibility to understand there's, for a lot of people unconsciously, that power dynamic. So what am I going to do as someone that is aware that that's happening, and how can I bring that into the space, whether I'm verbalizing it or not, as you're saying, with that curiosity or with that understanding, like, is this for me or is this for them? Because if what I'm offering is for everyone that I'm working with, then all that matters to me is their own work on themselves. It's not how they make me feel. And it's not about boosting, as you're saying, it's not about boosting my ego or anything that is that. And on top of that, I'm a male.
Yeah.
And I know, as you're saying, that we, as a patriarchal society, the role of the male facilitator, especially within the more conscious or spiritual spaces, I take a lot of responsibility on that, and understanding that, like, I have no idea what might happen with someone else, but I have seen in the past male teachers, spiritual teachers, and women, in a sense, throwing themselves at them. And therefore it was like, as a male at that time, I'm like, wow, like, like, you need to have a lot of like, a lot of that self-restraint not to do anything, as all of these women were throwing themselves at him. And now I'm like, even though I know that stuff happened, now I'm like, it's my responsibility, and I don't have anyone throwing themselves at me. But I understand my place in that, and I make sure that I am honoring myself, and I'm honoring the space that I am creating or holding, and I am honoring everyone that is showing up as the one that potentially is aware of that, whether people are aware of that or not. And I think that for me, it's so important nowadays, with everything that is happening in the world and all of the changes, to bring more and more awareness into that, and to have, conversations like this to allow, and I know that you've been having these conversations, to allow people to understand that there is this power dynamic, that there is stuff happening, and whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of the attendees or the students to understand this is happening unconsciously, the power dynamic, or is it the responsibility of the facilitator or the spaces, if it's in a festival or a conference, whose responsibility is it? And I think that it's such an interesting dynamic that I'm like, okay, I'm going to play my part into making sure that I am showing up in a way that feels right for everyone involved and not just potentially for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you're saying in terms of you've witnessed or seen other male spiritual teachers and women throwing themselves, and you've looked at that and gone, yeah, got to make sure that doesn't happen. I would suggest that your own awareness of it and your own containment of your sexual energy is possibly why you don't have that many women in those situations throwing themselves at you, because you've already taken the responsibility and contained the energy in such a way that there isn't that hook going out that, which is very, very subtle, sometimes not so subtle. And yet when I think of some male teachers or facilitators, etc., when they don't have that level of awareness, their sexual energy is actually in the game. It's looking, it's seeking, and then some women feel that and they pick it up and they respond. So it's absolutely the presenter, the teacher, the facilitator's responsibility to own that energy, contain that energy, and if they get approached, to just know, it's got to be that way.
Yeah, and something that from that is really interesting. Like I've been single now for many years, and like a lot of people ask me like, why are you not meeting anyone? I'm like, everyone that I'm meeting, like 90% of the people that I'm meeting are coming to my classes or know me as a facilitator.
Yeah.
And I like, if I'm in that role, as you're saying, like I'm basically in a sense blocking that from happening. I'm not seeing anyone with that kind of perspective, and like from my own personal life, it's like I'm not, I'm not being able to meet a lot of people that potentially would be like-minded people if they are doing things where I am going. And at the same time, I know this is a very, very challenging space to navigate, and how to, if I would be interested in someone that has come to one of my classes, it's like, okay, is there already this power dynamic being engaged, or how do I deal with that? And, as Brian, it's like wanting to integrate my own experiences in partnership with someone else and to explore that side of life as well. And at the same time, I have the other perspective. I need to honor that space that for me is a sacred space. For me, it's, like as I'm saying, honoring everyone involved. And I think that it's a really interesting dynamic as we move through all of this. And I think that that's where sometimes the line gets a little bit blurry, and for some people it's like, okay, they go beyond that.
It definitely can be blurred and grey, and there aren't any absolutes either. I mean, there are cases of, one woman on one of the threads around this, she said, well, I met my husband. He was a student in my class. He came to class a few times and he asked me out for coffee. We went out for coffee, and now we're married. So and in that instance, what unfolded. And so it's worth noting that there isn't always a power dynamic, you see. And so I think there needs to be sort of this blanket rule of containment of sexual energy, awareness of the dynamics, et cetera. And also, if someone who came to one of your classes was to then ask you out on a date, if you check in with your colleague and you check in with that person and you just see, is there a power dynamic here? What's going on? Is it someone I've worked with for a long time? Yeah, there's so many different factors. So what I've started to do as a facilitator, because I still, I'm single now, and I definitely think that whilst it's different for men, because most of the people I'm working with are women, but I do work with men, and I'm starting to notice, I'm like, oh, I've got to be really clear with boundaries here. And so checking in with colleagues, having conversations with colleagues, and letting that guide us. And I feel like that's the way forward, so that in those instances where it might actually be okay, you get the go ahead, not because you want to do it, but because you've got a couple of colleagues who go, in this instance, it feels legit and there's no power dynamic. This is not an abusive situation. This is all good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I think it's really interesting with this, as you're saying, like I know as well people that have been like, I know back from Argentina, like someone that now they're in their 70s. And when one was like teaching, like they've been in a relationship together for 50 years, and one was the other one's teacher. And it's like, well, things can happen, as you're saying, like that. It's just about understanding and about being able to figure out, okay, as you're saying, is there a power dynamic? Is this okay? Like, is there an understanding? And is that not just from my own perspective and that other person's perspective, because perhaps that attraction is not enabling a level of objectivity, but bringing in other people that I might trust and be like, hey, like, what do you think? Like, I'm doing that in a container that potentially is together and as well separately, to be able to understand what that's like. So I think there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there are. You know what the ironic thing is? The very fact you're aware of this, Brian, the very fact you're asking these questions means that you are very unlikely to ever abuse power dynamics, right? And the people that don't ask those questions are not aware of it. They're the ones that are abusing the power dynamics, etc. And so that's kind of the irony of it. But from having a conversation like this, someone who's on the edge, who hasn't even considered it, might suddenly go, oh, I need to be aware of this, because I care about people and I don't want to, we talk about abuse. Abuse is what happens when there's a power dynamic for a start. And again, it comes down to status and the way that humans inherently bow to status and discount their own judgment and their own thoughts. If someone who they perceive as higher than them is saying something, they're like, oh, I better go along with them, because none of it's conscious. It's just how we operate. And that's the giving away of power piece, where power, is given. If you look at what happened with Rod Stryker in the last few years, where he ended up having an emotional affair with a student for a year, and then they had sexual intercourse, I think, once. And when I read her account of that, what was really striking to me was the way that she constantly discounted her own intuition, because she perceived him as knowing more, because he was like 30 years her senior. He was the big head honcho yoga teacher, etc., etc. And that's where the situation becomes so dangerous and so damaging, because the person who perceives himself as less powerful discounts their own perspective, discounts their own thoughts, their intuition, their own wisdom. And then, of course, what I've noticed is anytime I've done that in the past, I then feel really shitty. I feel ashamed. I feel guilty. I feel bad. And that's the shit that can go on, you see.
Yeah.
So from a participant perspective, I think what's useful too in these conversations, for those of you that are students and are participants, is to recognize that whilst a teacher or facilitator might appear to have more power, ultimately all humans are freaking epic. All humans are amazing. And in each of us is this like an infinite source of epicness and power. And when you can access that and you can know that about yourself, instead of externalizing it and going, oh wow, that person's so amazing, it's like, yeah, so are you. You're freaking amazing too. And when that amazingness is discovered, then we are so much less likely to give away our power or seek a more powerful person in order to feel powerful, right?
Yes, definitely. Like I think that the more that people explore, and I mean me included, and we learn more about ourselves, we can get to that place of understanding that we already have the answers. And yes, someone else might be saying something and it's like, oh, that's an interesting take on that. Yet, yes, I'm not going to take everything on face value just because that person is the one talking or that person is the one facilitating. It's like, I will hear you. I resonate. There's something that I'm resonating with, yet I also have the answer. And I can feel, as you're saying, that intuition, that trusting ourselves as well as what we are hearing from someone else. And I'm interested in Kara-Leah in getting as well your take on with the case that you mentioned or any other case. So something happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
What now? Because from my perspective, there's a couple of things to understand here. A lot of times, and this comes from my work with trauma and family constellation and healing techniques, most people that behave in certain ways, they are playing out traumas. they are playing out certain unconscious behaviors. So a lot of times people don't even know that they are doing what they are doing or the impact of that. So once something happens, it's like, okay, what now?
Yeah. This is what the piece I've always been interested in, right? Because it doesn't faze me that shit happens, you know, because that's life. We make mistakes, we fuck up, patterns play out. So I get really curious about how people respond. So I don't know if you remember John Friend, who was the founder of Anusara. He went through this whole scandal, and I was like, oh, how's he going to respond? You know, Bikram, massive scandal. I mean, the dude was convicted of multiple rapes. You know, how's he going to respond? Is he really a yogi? And then when this stuff happened with Rod, it was the same question. I was like, whoa, how's he going to respond? And I'm not going to speak to the Rod situation because I don't know. I haven't talked to him. I haven't been around him. So I don't have enough insight to speak to it. I guess the local situation that I have been around and so can speak to is more what Matthew's been going through, Matthew Te Hoki. And what I've seen in Matthew is that he's shown a willingness to step into the arena. You know, when Brene Brown talks about that quote from some Roman philosopher, I think, about, you know, step into the arena. If you're in the arena, you get a say. And I feel like Matthew has stepped into the arena. He did a whole interview with me where he was willing to be questioned about power abuse dynamics, etc. And what I've seen there is that there's a willingness in him to do the work. And I also see how the patterns are really strong and really deep. And from my perspective, if we're on the path, right, this is about awakening. It's about realizing the self as awareness. And whatever happens is a mechanism that could potentially lead to our liberation if we're willing to dive in and let the ship burn. And that's the hardest work. That's the painful thing, because humans, again, coming back to status, the I self, as I call it, is all about position, and it's about defending and protecting and explaining and justifying. So when something happens, the first thing I do when I watch the person afterwards is I attune, are they defending? Are they justifying? Are they rationalizing? Are they explaining? Because if they are doing that, they are identified with the I self. If they're curious and they're open and they are owning what happened, then it's more likely that they're actually identified with awareness. And it's so incredibly humbling, because you've got to let the position burn. You've got to let your status burn. There has to be a letting go of the things that were there, you know. I feel like it's really important, though, as a community. One thing that matters a lot to me is that we don't reject or ostracize or blame or gossip about or talk badly of or make people who have made mistakes as such, make them wrong and bad. I feel as a community, it's so important to embrace and hold to account with loving awareness those of us that are going through transgression stuff, those of us that are facing up to our own darkness and our own shadow. And I would love to see more of that happening in the spiritual community, because some of what I've seen, particularly around the Matthew Te Hoki situation, is people rejecting him, judging him, pushing him away. And I'm just like, yeah, nah, we've got work. All of us have work to do in this situation, you know, and the work, he's got work to do. You know, people who've had encounters with him, transgressions, they've got work to do around boundaries and power, right? And then those of us who are sort of on the periphery, our work is to notice if we're judging, notice if we're rejecting, notice if we're separating, and work with that. So that's what I would love to see happen in these situations, is that every single person involved recognizes their own work, focuses on their own work, stops worrying so much about the other people, and goes inward. You know, I mean, for me, when it happened, I started to really look at, shit, am I doing this in any way, shape, or form? And making sure that all of my interactions, particularly with men, but also, you know, women misuse and abuse power in different ways. I think that's really important to recognize, that women can also abuse power. when it comes to, whether it's with other women or men. It's not a gendered thing. It's just that how men abuse power is different. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that, like you touch on a very, very interesting point. And I think that's something that there's all of these different perspectives of when something happens. It's like, well, you have like the doer, or everyone involved, plus, as you're saying, like the community. What can we do as people that are around this? I have seen in the past, like certain teachers that were not invited anymore to teach, or to festivals or to conferences. They were kind of like pushed aside, and others that were still invited. And I don't think that there's a right answer. I think that like all that I can do is, as you're saying, like ask these questions about myself, and at the same time understand, okay, like there's these communities here or anywhere, like in this case, and this is something that's happening here in our community. So how can we create safe spaces so that these things don't happen, as perhaps, I'm not saying like everything is not black and white, but that at least everyone is aware of this dynamic. So I think that this is the reason why I think that it's so important to have these conversations. As we have these conversations, people will know, okay, like I'm going next to a class, I'm going to a workshop, I'm going to a festival, and there is this power dynamic. Can I recognize it in myself? As soon as I see something, can I actually, like stand up and be like, okay, like I think that there's, like there's something that is not right here. So speaking up as well, it's important in those cases that happens. And I think that it's such an interesting space, because this is where we start, at least for me, like the work that we're doing as individuals, as well as the work that we're doing as collective. And sometimes there's, like different things that we need to do in both scenarios or both places.
There's a lot there. One thing I want to bring attention to is what you spoke about in terms of, say a teacher has transgressed boundaries, abuse, and, sometimes that can be quite intense, sexual abuse, in Bikram's case, rape. I absolutely agree that not allowing that person to teach anymore is really important. But you can see this is the difference between rejecting someone and putting in boundaries and holding them accountable with love. Is that you can say to someone, I'm not going to have you back at my studio to teach because X, Y, and Z happened, but I'm still here, I'm holding space for you, and I'd love to see you take these actions. And when I feel like you have integrated, healed, whatever, blah, blah, then we can talk about what it might feel like to bring you back into the space, right? So the difference between rejection of like, I don't like how you've behaved, you're awful, see you later, you're done, from, okay, I need to put this boundary in place, I need to hold you accountable here, and I'm still here to support and love you no matter what. That's big work.
Yes.
But I'm like, what are we here for in the spirit? What do we, we're doing all this freaking practice, etc. What are we practicing for? Practice loving the fuck out of each other, whatever that looks like, with accountability. Yeah.
I think that's, I see this as well on my own healing path of integrating. I remember, like my family, my grandpa especially, like he escaped from the Second World War. And one of the sessions that I was doing during my training for family constellations, my teacher brought into the space the integrating and the healing of and the forgiveness of Hitler.
Yep.
And that was, like that was for me really interesting, because when he said that, I'm like, what? Like, like he killed all of this, and then it's about, I understood it's about me and my experience of that, my integration of that. Not about not holding someone accountable, not about like it's about forgiving what they've done. It's about me not having the hold, or that not having a hold on me anymore. And I think that is, as I hear you saying that, if I understand correctly, like that seeing from that place of love and kindness and compassion, regardless of what it is that has happened, because that's the essence of who we are. We are that love.
Yeah.
We are that kind.
And you can't, it's really important to recognize that you can't fake it or leap over. So if there's an idea that I'm spiritual, I'm meant to be all loving and compassionate, but is denial of anger or denial of grief or denial of whatever, then that's going to lead to issues and problems. So there is a real need to be able to process, like, for example, if, my fictitious example, if I owned a yoga studio, teacher been coming regularly, I found out there's been a power abuse, and I was like, no, you can't teach there. If I didn't attend to my own feelings in terms of, did I feel disappointed? Did I feel rageful? Did I feel grief? Right? I need to feel, we talk about devouring, digesting, dissolving, like fully feel my own emotional experience, own my reactivity. And only then, only when we have completely felt what the situation brought up for us, is it then possible to access genuine loving compassion, right? And that is really important to understand. You can't fake. It's not about trying to be something. It's about feeling it all the way through to the loving compassion. Yeah.
Yes, I think that for me that is key in terms of that, like feeling experience, being able to process and integrate experience, whatever it is. Like, this is one of the things that I like with a few of my clients that they are more into the manifestation aspect of things. I'm like, well, like, you still need to integrate and heal like what happened in the past, because if not, then unconsciously you're putting all of that there. So we need to bring that element of, like, it's not all love and peace. Like, I would love it to be all love and peace, and it's like, well, yeah, stuff happens and stuff comes up. Can I allow myself to feel that? And for me, the key with this, I don't know, like from your perspective, perhaps with Tantra or with other like perspectives that you use, for me it's about feeling it and being aware enough not to react to it, but to respond appropriately as I actually allow myself to feel that and to integrate it, not push it away, not pushing down, not like pushing it anywhere. It's literally like, I'm going to feel this. And now that I felt it, I integrated. It's like, okay, how do I want to respond?
Yeah. Yeah. That's what it's all about, right? And feeling things, to genuinely digest something, there can't be any story about the feeling. And that's a huge shift when people begin to realize, oh, I can actually simply, there can be a feeling, say disappointment, that arises, but if my mind is going, what a fucker, I can't believe he did that, he's such an asshole, blah 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 blah, while the disappointment's there, the disappointment's not going to be digested. Right? So be able to unhook from that story and just go literally be with the feeling. Oh, disappointment in my heart, I can feel it spreading out like warmth, just being with that, being with that, being with that. That's immersing in reality as it is, and that is what it actually means to awaken. It's not about being able to manifest what you think you want. Good luck with that. Although things do move with more ease, but people do leap to that because it's so attractive. It's like, yeah, if I can do this, then I can, if I can clear my beliefs and, clear my unconscious blocks, then I can have everything I want. And it's like, yeah, but are you down with feeling what's present right now? Like all of it, the grief and the disappointment and the rage and the anger and the ickiness and the uncomfortableness and the anxiety and the depression. How are you with that?
Yes. And I think that, and this, as I know that this is what you do, it's like that path of liberation.
Yeah.
And that is not being tied with all of those stories, with all of those judgments, all of those labels. It's literally about being with what is, instead of what we want it to be and what we wish it would be. It's like, well, what is? Can I be with that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And and it's another a great way to describe the path of Tantra: embodied liberation. So you're liberated from conditioning, right? Conditioning might still arise in the system, but when there's orientation to awareness, it's not believed, it's not taken seriously, and eventually it's not acted out. And so it just begins to dissolve. Right? Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm just aware of our time
Mm.
because I know that we could talk way, way, way more. So it's just the last two things that I wanted to ask you. The first one is for anyone that is listening to us, what's one thing that you wish that they knew?
Mm. I wish that people knew that it's not about circumstances and rearranging the circumstances of your life in order to feel good or in order to feel whatever you want to feel. It's so much about burning attachment, burning aversion, and it's here right now. Like it literally is, no matter what the circumstances, that joy of beingness, that bliss is always here right now. You don't have to manage, manipulate, or control reality in order to feel the bliss. You just need to learn how to immerse fully. No, that wasn't very short and succinct, but that's the game changer. Stop trying to rearrange shit and just learn how to be with what is.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
And the last thing, Kara-Leah, is for everyone that is resonating with what you've been talking about, anyone that might be interested in working with you or attending something that you're doing, can you share where can they find you and what's coming up?
Okay, so what's coming up is a week-long, it's 5-day immersion called Ancestral Karma Prostrations Practice Intensive, where basically we spend 5 days doing a lot of practice and a lot of talking, sharing with this one specific practice. It's a tantric practice that literally burns up your ancestral karma. And it's next level. Like, oh my God, when I started, I did this for more than a year every single day, and it just made a massive difference in how I showed up to life. So come along, learn that practice, and become part of the community that I'm growing, leading, generating. And then if that's not your jam, I also do 3-month mentoring containers, which basically take you from whoa to go, right? It's like, here you are, where do you want to be? Let's do that thing. But it's through that lens of not getting what you want per se, but discovering who you are.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
And they can find it all on kara-leah.com, I am assuming.
Yeah, so that's my website, Kara-Leah.com. You can also find me. I have an online platform called the Tantrika's Toolbox, if you just Google it. And you can get lifetime access to that right now for like $97. Like I've just decided, you know how we have monthly subscriptions for freaking everything? I was like, you know what? I hate monthly subscriptions. So I'm going to start giving people lifetime access to my entire platform. And the introductory price is $97. I'm going to start doubling it. And then at some point I'll stop. But right now, that's what it costs. And there's classes, there's webinars, there's practices, there's teachings, there's a Telegram support group. Like if you're serious about waking the fuck up, that's where you want to come. The Tantrika's Toolbox.
Beautiful. Wow. So for everyone listening, like make the most out of this offer because as Kara-Leah was just saying, like that's the price at this point, lifetime access to all of these tools. So yeah, I will put all of the links on the notes so that everybody can access them easily. Yeah, if anything resonated, if you're listening or watching us, if anything resonated or there's anything that you'd like to share with us, please leave us a comment. And I would love always the conversation to continue. It's not just us doing this, it's everyone involved. So yeah, just let us know. And thank you, Kara-Leah, once again, for taking the time, for sharing with me, and for doing your own practice all of the time, like for living your authentic life as well. Yeah, just I hope that I'll see you soon on the dance floor or somewhere else.
Yeah, Brian, thank you. And, thank you for the way you show up as a man in this community, particularly as a facilitator and a presenter. Really, really appreciate it. It's so good to just have that, model of beingness. And I love the fact that you spoke into it and you shared your personal experience on this. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, as well for listening. And we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
What did you like the most about this episode? Take a moment to think about what change you can make in your life today.
Share your conscious action on social media using #ConsciousAction and tagging @ConsciousActionNZ so we can celebrate your impact on the world and create a ripple effect.
One easy action we would love for you to take right now is to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast. This will help us get these messages out into the world and inspire more people to take conscious action in their own lives, contributing to the better world we hope for.